Welcome to Women Seeking Wholeness. This is Cherie Burton. This is a podcast for women who long to feel, express, and be who they truly are. And today, going out on a limb a little bit here to discuss, I guess, a charged, controversial, sensitive topic, and that is women in religion. I'll actually be having kind of a series of these kinds of discussions with health practitioners, thought leaders, people who are kind of in the trenches working with women in mental health. And it hits very close to home for me, as you will find in this discussion with Natasha Helfer Parker, because of the loss of my sister to suicide and my aunt. But the implications are pretty widespread. Even though my sister had a mental illness at the time of her death, as did my aunt, there are cultural implications at play that don't always get discussed when it comes to mental illness and what can exacerbate an already predisposition or pre-existing genetic templating or whatever you want to call it, that it can become a setup or a firestorm for those already struggling with self-worth issues, who may already have biochemical challenges. And so we just get very real in this discussion. And I think this is the most real I've been, because actually I asked Natasha if she would be a guest on my podcast, and it so happens she turned the tables and started interviewing me, which was perfect. We just went on Facebook Live and she just talked to me. So that's what this recording is. So it was kind of interesting to be on the hot seat for once. You know, I get pretty transparent in this discussion about where I am personally at with religion. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormon, born and raised, and served in LDS mission, did all of the markers, I guess, as far as you can go within church activity to really have a beautiful contemplative walk with Christ and to raise my family that way. For those of you who follow my podcast, you know that I have gone through a series of transitions through the dark night of the soul, through lots of life experiences, outside stressors that have triggered this whole deprogramming and deconstructing and kind of unpacking the programming, which is a very healthy stage of, I'm learning, psychosocial development, spiritual maturity, lots of stuff around. And, you know, if you follow my podcast, you know that Mary Magdalene and learning about her life and teachings has been a huge catalyst for my, I guess you could say, rebirth and transformation. So with respect to women and what does that have to do with my religious path, just claiming that soul sovereignty and spiritual inner authority has been huge. And I think it's where we're moving as a world people. I think it's where all of the movements are happening, people having a series of awakenings around what do I know to be my truth versus what has been told to me should be my truth. So giving ourselves that freedom to explore and to internalize what helps us be mentally healthy in our religious and spiritual traditions. So not making any declarations of this is where I sit, but knowing that Mormonism is my heritage and it's very precious to me. And also, if you go to my website, I proclaim myself to be something of a Christian, yogi, Mormon, Buddhist, mystic, merely because I see truths in so many domains and embrace and open the door for whatever that looks like, because I believe we are all one. We are all one people. So in the framework of religion and mental health, that's the discussion I have with Natasha. And I talk about what triggers me. I talk about the women I attract in my community who are Mormon women, who are women of faith, very strong, many of whom don't necessarily struggle with a mental illness, but who are having some degree of struggle or wrestle with what they feel to be true or what they feel is missing within their religious path. So we explore that and we go pretty raw and real, and that's sort of her style and mine. Natasha Helfer Parker is a renowned figure within the Mormon community. She's a certified sex therapist. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. She just moved from the Kansas area, Wichita, Kansas area, I believe, to Utah because she started to notice that she had a real calling and a real interest and high demand of families, couples, individuals who were struggling within Mormonism with some of their mental health issues. And many of these health issues were rooted in lack of safety around discussing them in the larger religious settings, having some kind of fear or angst around the relationship with God and their worthiness and their standing in the community and in the eternities. So this has been a very specific type of internal struggle that isn't often discussed. Natasha Helfer Parker is the host of the Mormon Mental Health Podcast, and she's done a lot of work to open the eyes, ears, and understanding of those who really just need validated for some of the more weighty issues they face within high demand religions. You know, whether you are religious or not, as we also discuss in this episode, there are some puritanistic types of ideologies that get perpetuated just within foundations of nations. Many of the wars that have been started because of religion and because of different ways of thinking. So if we're going to evolve as a consciousness, we need to look at what we believe and how we polarize and separate ourselves from others because of our beliefs.
Interview yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Interview myself.
Or introduce yourself. Sorry, introduce yourself. Yes.
Yeah, because both of us come from the tradition of Mormonism, and, you know, trying to speak from like my heritage and sort of where I've walked, you know, just being quote unquote born in the covenant and having all of this heritage with pioneer ancestry, and having a mother who was a semi-feminist, I guess you could say, in the 60s. And for me, it's been descending and incarnating. I'm going to use a little bit of kind of mystical language here, but incarnating as a soul into a genealogical line where there was a lot of mental illness. So of the 6 children that my parents and I have had together, only myself and one other sibling were not diagnosed bipolar. And actually, the 7th child in our family came to us through my aunt. My dad's sister actually took her life, and in her suicide letter, left my parents to raise her 3-year-old son. So that happened when I was just getting ready to serve an LDS mission. I was 22 when this happened. And you know, I had just embarked. I had 2 years of social work school. I went to, it's Rick's College. It was Rick's College at the time, BYU, Idaho now. But I had just gotten an associate's degree in social work, thinking I was just going to solve all the problems in the world. And then this happened with my aunt. Then I served a mission, came home, went to the university, or actually went to BYU, started studying family studies, transferred to the University of Utah, and completed my psych degree there. Pregnant with mine and my husband's first. 6 months pregnant. So during all those, the loss of my aunt, and also my own mother, who very much struggled with mental illness, well, mostly just depression. We were raised in a small town in Wyoming. There wasn't a lot of awareness around what was happening with her. She spent many years in bed and was the most nourishing, nurturing, loving mother, a saint, literally. So where it hit closer to home is, after I completed my degree and started having children, so I have a sister a year older and sister 2 years younger, both of them diagnosed bipolar. And I spent some time visiting them in psychiatric facilities. I sort of was that middle child stabilizer, trying to find answers, trying to be an academic, trying to figure out and be the family hero, if you will. And kind of always this like high achiever by nature, to the point where I was trying to be a perfect Mormon as well in between all this. So where it got really real, and I've had some space around it now where I can talk about it without getting overly emotional, but my sister, 2 years younger than I, mother of 5, took her life at the age of 34 and left 5 children. And so at the time of her death, her children were ages 2 through 12. And she had quite a history of painkiller addiction, of course, bipolar, and was on scores of medications trying to manage her bipolar symptoms, ultimately overdosing with a drug used to manage her bipolar symptoms that her insurance company had sent her a 90-day supply of. So she went to a hotel in Salt Lake City, wrote a note telling the family she could be a better guardian angel than she could be a mother, and basically gave her husband permission to break their temple covenants and go marry someone else. so that if she was out of the picture, we'd all be better off. So that happened actually at the time I was Mrs. Utah. So it garnered some public attention to the extent that the Utah Attorney General asked me to sit on the State Suicide Prevention Council in Utah. And so I was put into a think tank because of my background in psych, as well as my public role as Mrs. Utah. I was put into these think tank meetings with psychiatrists, mental health professionals in all shapes, sizes, forms, whatever, and lots of different domains with youth. And because at that time, Utah was pretty much leading the nation with suicide. There were also professors, there were all kinds of educators. And here I am representing suicide survivors. And so I plunged into researching what's going on here in Utah, what's happening with that. And to be honest with you, Natasha, the statistics have not changed in 15 years. We're still way up there. And I tried to look at it from more of a sociocultural standpoint, not necessarily just familial inheritance or what have you. And so 15 years later, we're still healing as a family from this. It was an absolute shock. There's a book by, I think her name is Carla Fine, called No Time to Say Goodbye, about losing her son to suicide. And she said, if you have experienced the death of someone close to you, the world explodes in suicide. The world explodes. And that's definitely what we've all experienced. It was a wake up for me, a whistleblower moment in time, so that I could really climb underneath what's really happening, what is really, really happening. And so it's taken all this time, but I now feel pretty confident in some of my theories around not necessarily religion is to blame, but I think Utah is a very unique state in the way that things are handled with mental health, as you probably are guessing, Natasha, and also that there are some very interesting family system dynamics that contribute to the exacerbation, particularly of women in mental health here in Utah. So that is where I've, having some space and time around this and really diving into it socioculturally, as well as what are the implications in epigenetics, like with, you don't just inherit your ancestors' eyes, nose, hair color, what have you. You inherit their unprocessed trauma. So that's another thing that I have really dove into and to try to understand the real issues. And that includes our pioneer ancestry. That includes the women who did not have a voice, who crossed the plains or had to practice polygamy or had to outsource their inner authority. So I really have gone into the depths on what this actually means for us, from an ancestral line standpoint, epigenetically, as well as the sociocultural implications.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing so much of that story.
Long intro.
No, that's really, really important. Are you comfortable at all talking about your own relationship with Mormonism and where you are right now as far as your relationship with the church? And it's fine to say, no, yeah. I'd rather not.
No, I'm great with that. And this is something I think that I've kind of been in the mystery with a lot of people, because I do have a podcast. I am quite vocal in some of the distortions that I see, not just in the LDS realm, but in most religions, in most longstanding religions who've had patriarchal hierarchy structures. Where am I at? So I embrace Mormonism as my heritage. I am grateful for many of the gifts and blessings that it has afforded me. I can't even help but use the word blessings. Like, it's so ingrained to say that. I'm grateful for the structure. When I started to advance in trying to understand the theology of a Heavenly Mother or any kind of women's issues, that's where I experienced a lot of the disconnect, where let's dangle this carrot of, there is a mother in heaven, but let's not talk about her. And I wanted to know more. And I pined and prayed and fasted and sobbed to the heavens to find out what is my eternal station as a woman? How does it fit into Mormon theology or doctrine? And what is going against my knowing and personal intimations, and why is there a distance here for me? Why doesn't it feel like I'm connecting? So I actually went way out of the box to study divine feminine, to go on sacred pilgrimages throughout the world. I'm a hobbyist Mary Magdalene scholar, and I have just given myself that permission to not accept everything as doctrinal and absolute, especially as it relates to women and inner authority. And so I don't outsource that anymore. I have claimed my own inner authority. And I also teach feminine embodiment wisdom, which is basically, things like yoga, where you experience the knowing in your body and the resonance, and you use that as your compass. So I have dear friends and family who don't believe what I do, and vice versa. And I feel totally aligned with that. I think it is important to live a moral life and to love people. And this is why I love what I've learned about Mary Magdalene, is that, and the Gnostic Gospels, is that teach about love and inclusion. And that's where I'm at. Like, let's just all, like, why are we so hung up on policy? And why are we so hung up on exactness? And why are we so hung up on the afterlife? Why are we so hung up on who's going to make it and who's not? Why are we so sad about it? Like, it's just a non-issue for me. I just know that love supersedes everything. And so I'm not in a place of fear around my salvation or losing any of my loved ones at the seat, around that table of heaven, or however that looks like.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into, I guess, some thoughts about religion in general, right? So there's a lot of research out there about religious communities. And of course, religious communities in of itself as a term is quite wide. and I think that I remember one time listening or learning about a book where they kind of organized religions on a spectrum of not necessarily doctrine, but spectrum of what it takes to belong to the tribe, quote unquote. And so on that spectrum, there were 6 categories. And of course, it's funny, I don't remember the 3 over here because they didn't really apply to my situation as much. But on this side, there was like fundamental religions, orthodox religions, and conservative religions, right? And and I forget, gosh, I need to look that up again. Anyway, my whole point is that when we talk about whether or not religions have an effect on mental health and whether or not they affect people in certain ways, we want to remember that there's a spectrum. And in Mormonism, by this particular book, landed on mainstream Mormonism landed in the orthodox category. And that was due to the many markers that it takes to be considered kind of a righteous, worthy, temple card carrying holder Mormon, which, are all this, there's just a lot of language there in regards to even all those words I just said. And so that surprised me when I heard about it, because I would have thought, being a Mormon myself, that we would have been more like in the conservative group, which is kind of where the Catholics land, and the Baptists, and, where I knew our doctrine was fairly similar in a lot of ways, or at least fairly similar in rigidity versus flexibility. But no, we were over here in Orthodoxy, which was more similar to Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and of course the fundamentals would be more like the Amish, FLDS, certain Muslim sects, things like that. So yeah. Of course, the Muslim religion in of itself has different sects in of itself. So does Judaism. Like there's Orthodox Judaism, there's progressive Judaism. So as you mentioned religion, I just thought of that because I think it's important to put that into when we say, well, how does religion affect people? This kind of stuff matters. You mentioned patriarchy. I would also want to mention high demand, which I think is these markers. So there's a lot of demand on your lifestyle. You have to do, many, many things to fit into that Mormon box, everything from daily scripture study to having a calling to wearing garments to committing certain things, in the temple covenant type of ceremonies, etc. And so how does this interplay? Because what's interesting about the research is that many studies will show that religious people are actually doing quite well, that are healthier, that they live longer, that they report being in happier marriages. Some even report that they're having better sex, although, I start thinking about the missionary syndrome, which is sometimes people will report better than what they actually are living because they feel this sense of like, I have to, not in a lying way, but really like, I have to be happy, right? I am happy. It's like we kind of convince ourselves that we're happy in a lot of ways. And so, and I do think that there are a lot of benefits to religious cultures from a mental health perspective, especially community. I think community is the biggest one. If you happen to fit pretty fairly comfortably into those parameters, then you have a tribe to belong to. And that tribe, in Mormon land, does a lot for you, right? Like they bring you casseroles when people die in your life, and they show up when you're having a baby, and they come and rake your leaves, when you're older in life, and you have lots of activities, and they help you raise your kids. And
as long as those activities are supporting the doctrine, you usually get the support. But if you're going through a crazy divorce, or you're an addict, or you're doing something like you're in an unplanned pregnancy, I mean, those are not casserole bringing activities.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's what I meant by if you fit that box. If the dramas, if the tragedies fit the box, then we'll help you, right? And again, that's not just in Mormonism. That's in a lot of communities, right? This is a community-wide problem that certain struggles aren't raised to the level of community support, for sure. So I think what we want to do, I just want to lay that out there because I do want to recognize that there can be a lot of benefits to religious community. I think a lot of people in Mormonism benefit from those positives. And yet we're here to talk about the other side of that coin, which often doesn't get talked about. So we're not here just to talk about the bad because we like talking about the bad. We like to talk about the other side, or at least I do, because I don't think that gets as much airtime. In Sunday school, we're not talking about our limitations. In Relief Society, we're not talking about our limitations as a church. Neither are we over the pulpit in general conferences usually. So I think it's important to give voice to when these things actually can be in of themselves harmful. So there are certain doctrines and expectations that in of themselves can start mental health issues. And also like what you were talking about with your family, if there's a propensity for mental health concerns, then certain aspects of certain religions can actually exacerbate that mental health concern. So that's what we're here to talk about today.
That's right.
So
but
I just want to say that because I think it's important, because otherwise people are like, you're not being fair, or that's, it doesn't corroborate some of the research out there. But we also do have research that shows that if you fall on the margins of a religious community, that can actually be very detrimental to mental health and relational health, because now it's like you don't fit into your tribe. And what do we know about not fitting into your family or your culture or your tribe is that you feel ostracized, you feel isolated, you feel alone. Many times you're scapegoated or blamed by the community or by your family people. So all of those things, of course, have a huge impact. And we know this specifically through the research on gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folks. Again, not just in religion, but in our country overall, that the more that we have accepted them.
Yes, I think I think you're hard pressed to find a religious structure that caters to the marginalized. And this is especially true in high demand religions, as you noted, like Mormonism, because there's a cultural belief that, and I would say I would even go so far as to say a theological or doctrinal assumption that if you are experiencing some kind of socioculturally unacceptable choice, or you're the recipient of it, that it's something that you've done in your spiritual practice. There's something you're not doing in your spiritual practice, or you're not getting. Like you're too dense to figure out the process, obviously, or you're not close enough to Christ, or you're not doubling down on enough spiritual practices, because the assumption is if you were, you wouldn't feel marginalized. You wouldn't be depressed. You wouldn't be experiencing addictions or And that in my research is what I found to be the most predominantly destructive. It's when you personalize, and it can't possibly be the system. It can't possibly be the hierarchical, that's intact. That's perfect. So it can't possibly be them. It has to be me. I'm the squeaky, I'm the squeaky wheel here. And that's where it gets really damaging.
Yes, I couldn't agree more on that. And the sad aspect of that is that I think that, like, for example, when I think about our relationship with mental health services as a church, as a Mormon church, it wasn't that long ago that we included psychiatry and the mental health professional as one of the enemies to the church, right? Mm-hmm. Along with feminism and, intellectuals and things of that nature. We've come a long way as a church in regards to that. And many, many mainstream members are comfortable seeing therapists and psychiatrists and getting mental health help. And at the same time, we still have this very interesting tension between what you just said. I mean, we do have leaders every now and then, nowhere near as often as I would hope, but every now and then saying, hey, if you need to get professional help, that's an important thing for you to do. We, of course, have bishops now referring more than ever to therapists. And at the same time, this doctrine still persists. And that's what we hear much more of, is that somehow your life happiness is a product of your worthiness, right?
Yes.
So the more that you perform and act in a way that is, corroborates the gospel teachings, then the more you're going to be rewarded. So, of course, what do you assume from that? It's like, if I'm suffering in some way, it must be because I did something wrong, or that other people treat you like that. Even if you know that's not the case, people in your community will look down on you, or not include you, or say kind of passive aggressive comments to you, because that's kind of where they're coming from.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying. I think too that it's double speak and double messaging. So on the one hand, it's like, God loves you unconditionally. Your worth is, far above rubies. Your worth is intact. You're divine, you have divine worth, all the programming and stuff around that. Then in the next thing, it's all about striving for your exaltation and what's separating you from the love of God. And what I've come to know and what resonates with me and what makes me feel the most mentally healthy is that there is nothing that can there is no performance-based worth paradigm for me. I'm 51 years old. I've had to do a lot of work on this. It's the programming I got, and then the double messaging is, this actually wasn't a conditional God. This actually wasn't a conditional regard. Unconditional regard. It was, if you hit these markers, then you might be in the elite club of the people who really did get it. They really made it. They cracked the code you couldn't. When there's all this striving and all this reaching, and there's actually language in the Young Women's theme that just came out about striving twice. So while we have huge leaps in some of the theology and in some of the policy, I can definitely see there's still some messaging around working so hard to earn your worthiness. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's just intact. It's sacred. There's nothing that you can do to compromise that unconditional regard from God. If I were to think otherwise, I wouldn't be emotionally or mentally healthy. And that's just something that I had to do for myself. And it was actually quite liberating to embrace that and to teach honestly.
Can you repeat that again? You just said some words that I really liked. So in order to be emotionally and mentally healthy, what did you have to do with the worthiness narrative?
I had to claim unconditional regard and worthiness as a completely intact and indestructible aspect to my relationship with God and my eternal salvation. Irrespective of my performance, nothing can separate me from the love of God. Nothing. And that's actually in the Bible. And it's everywhere in LDS scripture, but everybody wants to look past that here's what I'm tired of, Natasha. I'm tired of sitting in Relief Society and swimming in shame and no one calling out the elephant in the room. And that is, sisters, we've just given this beautiful lesson on how much God loves you and how amazing you are as a mother and wife, and daughter of God. What can we do to be more worthy of the blessing of XYZ? What is it that we need to do to be more counted, more worthy to do XYZ? I'm over that. I'm over it. It's no, I don't have to do anything. I can just be in a space of love, which is what Christ taught. And to me, that's the most emotionally and spiritually and culturally and familially and religiously sound doctrine, healthy doctrine. I'm over everything else. I'm done with it.
Well, and just 2 points I want to make, because you're making, of course, comments from a believing stance, right? Like that you're making comments, for example, that assume God exists. And so I just want to make room for those who maybe have, moved on from even a deist belief, and are still affected by this kind of worthiness narrative. Because I would, I've worked enough with enough faith transitioners to know that just because you stop believing in God, or even stop believing in Mormonism, but maybe keep believing in some type of divine entity, this narrative that we've kind of many of us have grown up with, doesn't go away. So I want to say that. And then I also just want to make sure that people, when you say what you say, which I completely agree with, a lot of people might say, well, but it matters what we do in our lives. And I would say, yes, of course it matters what we do with our lives. And many of us want to do good things. But when the motivation for doing good things comes from a perspective of I have to prove myself as a worthy person, that's where it becomes really problematic from a mental health perspective. Most of us want to strive. Most of us want to learn. Most of us are just wired. Otherwise, we get bored for progress, for movement in one way or another.
Yeah.
So we're not saying just sit around on your britches, everybody, and bask in your worthiness, because that's not a mentally healthy model either.
Yeah. And you know, as you go through Erik Erikson stages, I mean, to speak from a psychological, right? Like as you go through the behaviorist stuff and you go through the Carl Jung stuff and you go through Erik Erikson and you go through Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's an assumption that you get to a space of developmental maturity where you realize it's not so diplomatic. It's not so cut and dry. It's not so absolute. So that's why I say it serves you to a point where you're like, okay, I get it. There's some safe parameters here. I've got this beautiful community. But for some souls, for some people, irrespective of where they fit in religious paradigms and structures, they get to a point where they just need freedom. They just need expansiveness. And so here again is where the double talk happens. Brothers and sisters, we encourage you to get personal revelation. The other side of it, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's so liberating and freeing. I can get answers for my own life. And then on the other side, brothers and sisters, it has to fit in these parameters or it's not revelation.
That's right.
And so you have no freedom to have your own spiritual sovereignty in connection with God because it has to fit in an external structure. And that's where I rebelled. And in saying that, I love that you brought up that some people don't, ascribe to the Judeo-Christian or, even any world religious belief of there being a higher something that's governing whatever. I totally respect that. I also feel too that you can't get away from that programming without some serious mental health support. And it's beautiful when you hit. So transitions are rites of passage. Unprocessed trauma for me now is the new frontier in empowerment for people because we get to look at what we've inherited from our ancestors, all the beliefs, all the patterns, all the things we've come to inherit as truth. And we get to take it out and look at it and go, no, that doesn't resonate for me. I'm going to go over here and do this because this makes me feel better in my body. This makes me a better mother. This makes me a better father. And so unpacking all of that through trauma living in your body from those falsities and illusory beliefs and literally climbing in and going and examining it and saying, how does this fit for me? If I ascribe to this, am I healthier? So I attract a lot of women in transition who are like, and not just religious transition, but I definitely attract women who are, is this okay that I believe this? Because it really resonates with me. I'm like, what do you think? You don't have to outsource. You don't need my opinion, but I will certainly affirm for you that if it resonates for you, it's your truth.
Yeah.
So I think where we're headed, I think, to be honest, most churches are decades behind this movement on the earth of spiritual sovereignty. And our millennials get it. Our next generation under the millennials, whatever they're called, Zers, they get it. They're getting it. They just are like, well, that's messed up. Why would you believe that? Well, because it came from God through this source. This person said this. Well, it doesn't add up. So I'm a head out, like.
Well, I love that you brought up developmental theory, because I agree that, from teenagerhood on, really, some of the tasks in our developmental journeys are to claim our own authority. Like, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And a lot of times I believe one of the hindrances to mental health is that high demand religions such as Mormonism kind of keep you in a pre-adolescent or even adolescent relationship perpetually throughout adulthood, right? You can still get in trouble for masturbating, for example, as a 40-year-old widow, right? Or you can still get in trouble for, wanting to pay your tithing in a certain way, or or even having different beliefs, in regards to how you see the divinity, or if you want to pray to a heavenly mother instead of a heavenly father. These are all things that adult members of our church have been punished for through, the removal of certain rites and rituals, and even membership type of status. So that's not good for mental health.
No, it's not. And that's why Mormonism fits in that category that you, at the onset of our discussion, talked about, because we are Orthodox. We are an Orthodox structure. And that's why people are checking out. That's why there are people who are very disillusioned and are personalizing. Even those who have the knowing in their bodies don't, like me. I have to find a way to make this fit. And still, I have young children. I have a married daughter, 3 college students, and a 7 and a 5-year-old. And so that's where, like, how do I stay in healthy community and let my children experience healthy community and not have them ascribing to the program of follow the prophet over and over and over and over? How do I give them that healthy balance of, yes, these leaders are teaching such beautiful truths. However, here's the other double talk happening. I want you to land in your liberation. I want you to land in your spiritual sovereignty. As your mother, I'm going to guide you to your highest mental health. And what does that feel like for you? So it's tricky, and I'm still mapping that out and sitting with it and figuring it out. But I can tell you that I have talked to hundreds and hundreds of disillusioned Latter-day Saint women, Mormon women, who are having these knowings in their body, who are experiencing some dissonance with some of the teachings and doctrine, but don't feel safe enough to express it within the confines of the, actual church meetings, or even in smaller circles with their other women in their ward, because they will be deemed not obedient or questioning. Or I think we need to come up with an acronym of questioning, just like we have LGBTQ. I think we need a questioning religious acronym, because it is a spectrum.
We can even be seen as dangerous.
Yes. And we are going to be, but I can tell you there's a revolution happening.
Yeah.
And these are good, honest, faith promoting women and men who are saying, hey, there's a fallout happening within and around me, and all my spiritual practices combined are not fixing it.
And so how to your point, when people feel silenced, or I can't really share my experience, I can't really speak up in Relief Society and say something without causing a problem, or even in my family, structure at home, what do we think that does to mental health, right? We know that when people feel silenced and, afraid, that's not good for, when we create spaces where people can talk. And I mean, what's therapy all about? What's the basis of therapy, right? It's a non-judgmental space where you can come in and really say anything, and, have a space that holds you in a space of somewhat being safe.
And honestly, one of the reasons that we found when I was part of this study with Utah Attorney General's office, and one of the reasons that Utah did lead the nation and still does, I believe, after 15 years of them climbing into this issue of antidepressant usage, is because there is this, I can't talk about this in church, but I can go to a mental health practitioner, and even the hierarchies and our leaders are encouraging that. So we're going in droves to fix the issues that should be handled in-house, which is, you are a being of infinitesimal worth. You are whole. You are not broken. You are experiencing these things, which is totally normal. And there's no, like, for instance, one of the things that we have known now through science, Mayo Clinic, all this research, all this, is that one of the ways you come into spiritual practice is through breath work, is through stilling the mind, is through some of these practices that encourage inner alignment. And there's no place for that in Relief Society. Everything is outsourced. Everything is deferred. Everything is this okay? We also have to have presiding authorities at literally everything we do, because somehow it's not okay to have a spiritually sovereign stance as a woman, even in our larger meetings. So it sends a message that there isn't a space for inner authority and inner alignment. Although we're saying they are telling us to get personal revelation, it has to fit in a parameter of being okayed, and approved.
So you started off the interview by sharing this really very tragic story of your sister and some of the themes that she was dealing with, and I know we've talked a little bit before, even this interview, about that experience and the way that you kind of portrayed her to me, is that she was, for all outer appearances, very much a perfectionist, very much had kind of everything in place, and, was a very loving mother to her children. And so I guess I'd like to give you some space to move into the more specific topic of women in particular in Mormonism, and some of the themes that you've noticed kind of prop up, like if you can say, okay, here's 2 to 5 themes that I've kind of studied out and thought these are problematic. What would those be, other than I think we've been talking more general?
So one of them, although when my sister died, her children were very young, ages 2 to 12, it's been 15 years. And so this wouldn't necessarily, it would apply to her actually, because motherhood she was a mother bear. She was doing scrapbooks for her kids and trying to do home music school. And, she actually had a state calling as the woman music director. She was very gifted musically. She played several instruments by ear. She sang with the voice of an angel. She was born with perfect pitch. She was very gifted, which is typical of a lot of people who are bipolar. They're high creatives. One of the things that we discovered after her death, as she had stopped through her journal entries, is that she had stopped praying for 2 years. She literally, this is a woman who was so involved in church activity. Her husband actually has a really high profile church employment position. And he works directly with some of the members of the 12. And they have seen his journey trying to work with her in and out of recovery programs and whatnot. So even as she's getting priesthood blessings, and even as she's doing everything that she could to tick the box, she stopped praying. And so her to everybody else, she seemed to be doing the practice, and also a very loving person by nature. She didn't know a stranger. She would bring addicts off the street and bring them into her house. Very loving, open, extroverted, non-judgmental person. There wasn't a space for her to feel that way with God. So in her journal entries, she was worthless. And she didn't pray because she didn't feel worthy to approach God because she wasn't perfect. And so back to the mother, what I see that a lot with women, and I see with women the issue of mothering. What does it mean to be a righteous mother? What if one of your children makes a choice that goes off path, so to speak? What did I do to create that? What can I do more to bring that soul back? And so I see that a lot. And because we don't have a developed theology of a mother in heaven, she's absent. She's voiceless. She's underrepresented. And it doesn't seem to be a priority for our priesthood brethren to give us something more definitive. If they're truly, this is where Wild Fierce Feminine comes out. If they're truly prophets of God, they would be feeding the hungry, hurting souls of women by giving us something more about our mother figurehead, our mother God. You can say heavenly parents, but you can't say heavenly mother. That's dismissive. And you're putting that into, everyone's like, oh, it's such a big, great stuff that they said heavenly parents in the new young women's theme. Well, they didn't say it in the young men's, and they said heavenly parents, but they should have said heavenly mother and heavenly father. So I know my sister struggled with polygamy. I know my sister struggled with her mothering. I know she struggled with personal worthiness of not being enough, not doing enough. What more should I be doing? Why is this not, And then, of course, in her suicide letter, it was all about her marriage. I don't think that she and her husband would have ever gotten divorced. I can't say that definitively, but they had made temple covenants, and she would have rather died than break them. And she said as much in her suicide letter. There was a Mormon apostle who actually Jeffrey R. Holland came and spoke at her funeral. And at the time, President Hinckley was the prophet, and he sent a message because he knew David and Shauna personally, my brother-in-law and sister. And what's interesting is that Elder Holland was so beautiful at her funeral about talking about how she would not be denied any of her blessings. She would be with her children in the hereafter. They would feel her presence. So that was really beautiful. I think the disconnect for some people is, and for her, for that matter, is how could how could a loving God turn any of these people away that I am associated with? Addicts, the outliers, the marginalized. That's the world my sister lived in while being an almost perfect Mormon woman on the outside. So for her, there was this I don't get it. I don't get it, but I would rather die than break my covenants. I would rather die than have my children visit me in a state hospital. I'd rather be a guardian angel because I'm in such a mentally unwell, toxically ridden body. Toxically not being a word, toxic belief ridden body that can't quite get it together. I'm going to be able to better serve them as a guardian angel. So my sister represents the extreme version of the vast majority of LDS women who get very real with me on how they feel with the undeveloped doctrine of a Heavenly Mother, with their mothering not being enough, with being responsible for their children's choices and internalizing it as they're not being a good enough mother, and not being good enough in general, performance-based worth, striving to be worthy enough to be able to receive gifts and blessings. And that's what I see. And that was the real disconnect with my sister, I believe.
Yeah. So I would just say amen to all of this as far as the work that I have done with the variety of Mormon women I have seen. And if I was going to pick out the themes that I heard you talk about, definitely mothering identity. It's pretty much exclusively the identity we talk about when we talk about females in the Mormon church. Therefore, it ignores all other aspects of the complex identities of who we are as individuals. And so when you only allow for one aspect of your identity, even if mothering is something that you're really, aligned with and love, which many women do, some women don't, some women don't feel like natural mothers.
Or they feel like a natural mother and they haven't been given that opportunity.
That's right too. We have all of the messages of infertility and how complicated that becomes when, again, if it's worthiness based, even though, again, I think this is where, like you're saying, two sides of the coin come out. You do have talks that specifically say this is not, infertility is not because of worthiness. And yet it's very hard not to assume or think that when you're suffering through wanting pregnancy and you're not getting the blessings. And we have this very equational relationship with rewards, that we get rewards and blessings when and if we do things right. This also shows up in kind of prosperity gospel type things, even financially and things like that, which is a huge problem for the chronic issue of poverty, and not just here in the United States, but elsewhere, when we think about ourselves as an international church. So this mothering identity sounds definitely like a theme that you're bringing up. Like it's one part, it's the only part that gets kind of, brought out. It even trumps wife identity big time.
Yeah.
Even though we talk about marriage a lot, we really don't teach women much about relational skills. We don't teach them about their sexuality. We don't teach about intimacy with a partner. We really see it's kind of like, yes, of course you're married because then we're going to be mothers. So the whole
that's your
eternal, goes in that regards.
That's your eternal station is populating, worlds. And I mean, in Mormon theology, it's just motherhood. There's nothing else we have to hang on to other than she's a mother.
And I do think that ties back to the polygamy doctrine, because if you're going to have polygamy doctrine in the afterlife, which we still very much have, the relationship with the partner, with the husband, isn't as prioritized. If you're going to have to share your husband with hundreds of thousands of other women.
Insert vomit.
Or, even if it's just 2 or 3, however people, visualize that. Cause I know a lot of people have their own kind of weird ways of thinking about that. But the wife identity isn't really as important, which I see showing up as a sex therapist a lot in regards to just the absence of sexual identity in Mormon women for many of them. And then to add to the Mormon identity issue, you're bringing up a very good point that we know through the study of social science that when you are not represented in the role modeling of authority figures, so like if Black people are not represented by other Black people in authority figures, it's very hard to make those things about you, right? Or brown people or women. So if you have a father and you have patriarchy and you have male leadership and there's no female representation, it can be very difficult to really internalize spirituality in the same way that those who are represented can do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think this generation, and I would include myself in this generation, even though I'm older, is that's no longer acceptable to just say it's going to all work out in the end. If it doesn't resonate right now, it doesn't resonate right now. You have a spirit, you have a soul, it knows truth. And to say, hey, just accept it because this is all the information we have, God's going to work it out in the end, is no longer okay.
Yeah.
And it's impeding people's peace of mind and mental health in the now.
And the second theme that I heard you bring up is obviously perfectionism, right? And when you do have, like you said very well, behaviorally based worth, there's always something more you could be doing. I could have gotten up 5 minutes earlier. I could have, I missed that one family home evening.
What if I would have paid $10 more on my fast? What if I would have doubled my fast offerings? Then maybe that would have happened. Yeah. It's all
so anything that has to do with equational worth or behavior centric worth really can come back to bite people. And I think like we're saying, okay, so your sister, some people might say, well, she had bipolar and that's why she interprets it in such ways. And I would never interpret it that way. I just want to say that this your sister's maybe an extreme example. And like I said at the beginning, maybe her mental health issues did exacerbate these concerns, but people with no mental health concerns have a lot of these same fears, have a lot of these same worries, are affected kind of in an anxious type of way, even if they're not necessarily fitting the criteria for a generalized anxiety disorder. It still affects their
it's
sense
a pervasive, yes, absolutely. And it's almost like if you study a lot, like I love Carl Jung and I love what he teaches about the collective unconscious. I mean, this is a collective unconscious belief that we carry as a wound for the feminine. Yeah. This is not just, we can't just relegate it to Mormonism or high demand religions. I think across the board, it's, am I worthy? Am I doing enough? Am I enough?
It's also an American culture thing. You know, I think that we're a very productivity oriented culture. You have to prove your worth through being wealthy or educated or something along those lines. And so,
but I will say in Mormonism, it's like, it's on steroids.
Yes. Yeah. I usually say most of the issues we have are not Mormon centric or Mormon lonely, but they're Mormon exacerbated or Mormon quirky. Right?
We are a peculiar people.
We are. We have peculiar interpretations to universal themes.
And I have to say, I've interviewed a lot of women who are in other Christian religions who've become equally disoriented and disillusioned for the very same reasons.
Yeah, a lot of this can be, traced back to puritanical cultures, which our country was founded on, as well as Judeo-Christian beliefs as well. So we're not the only high demand religion by any means. And then the third theme that I hear, which I think, is, I'm not sure if the most tragic, but just really kind of hits me for some reason in my emotional feelers today, is this sense that your sister really felt like sacrificing self was much more important than hurting others. And so I do believe that women in particular are put not only into a mothering role, but a caretaker role, whether it's a caretaker or a peacemaker or a helpmeet. There's language in scripture, even whether it's my husband's needs come first, or my children's needs come first, or my mother's needs come first. I can't offend my mother or hurt my mother's feelings. So I need to watch and be careful what I say. And that bleeds into so many relationships where this really beautiful thing of relational sacrifice, which I think most of us could have some healthy relationship, really becomes very unhealthy because in a sense, it kills us. It's like, I don't matter as much as anybody else. And that's tied with motherhood, but it's also tied, I think, to a general community type of feel.
I think it is tied to gender too, in this regard, because Eve came second. We're always
she came as a helpmeet. That was her role.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of ways to spin helpmeet is like an equal to or saving partner. Like she had a saving capacity with Adam. And there's some beautiful things I've seen in interpretations with that. But in the context of what we're talking about in Mormonism, there is no prophetess. There is no visible priestess. There is no women in the councils, in the decision-making policy decision-making councils. There's no people, there's no women in, I guess you could say that are praying and fasting about the greater issues that affect the worldwide church. It's all men. And so until there's a shift in equal authority and equal visibility and equal speaking out, if you will, there's going to be this dissonance that women feel. And I think that too, there is with sacrifice and what you're talking about with that, there's a pure version of that. And then there's a really destructive, like always putting your needs second, always putting your deferring. I mean, even in the larger Christian community, there's a whole I am second thing, which I see the purity in that because God comes first. But when you're aligned spiritually and you're in inner alignment and you feel resonance and you feel connected to God or the divine or however you define that, you are one. You are one and you don't come second. because you are aligned. And this is something not being taught. It's not being taught. And for women who are seeing the disparity of the lack of visibility in being able to participate in the highest level meetings and the highest decision-making meetings, and even so far as to say, the representation of our general conference, where we have 2 women and 20 men speaking or whatever it is, that's not equal authority. That's not equal voice. And every single time these women are talking, they're quoting priesthood leaders. Mm-hmm. So until we claim this embodied feminine wisdom and we rise in equal spiritual authority and visibility, there's going to be marginalization. And unfortunately, it's women not talking about it at church, but going to their mental health practitioners to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, so I would, I guess, close off by allowing you to possibly, we've spent a lot of time describing the problems. What would maybe, could you rattle off 2 to 5 solutions that maybe aren't going to come from the top down? It'd be nice if our church culture could change, and it does change, over time, and it has been slowly, but I think more slower than we'd like to see. And more slower than is necessary, given all the resources that we have in the mental health profession that the church, for whatever reason, doesn't necessarily ascribe to. But so if you're listening, if you're listening to us, or if you're a woman who's struggling to make sense of her own worth, or with perfectionism, or a sense of the weightiness of motherhood identity or caring identity, what are some thoughts that you have for people to self-care?
I'm so glad you asked me that so we could end on a high note. I would say don't wait for the policies to change. Don't wait for the cultural shift. Be your own kind of revolutionary. That's what Jesus was. And honestly, that's what Mary Magdalene was. If something doesn't feel like it aligns for you, let that be okay. Honestly, yoga and breath work were massive for me to be able to align with my own truth and my own knowing. Quite liberating. I know a lot of women who practice yoga who actually go through a major religious transition because of that fact. So let that be what it is. You may or may not transition through religion, but you'll at least know how to listen to your truth. So definitely body movement, breath work, inner alignment. I think too, self-advocacy. So it's okay to sit in an ecclesiastical leader's office, like a bishop or a stake president, and tell them what your knowing is. I've been on the hot seat with that. And both my bishop and stake president came to my home to try to understand me better. And I stood my ground and spoke my truth, and they felt that resonance within me. You could say it was the spirit that they felt. And they didn't have true answers for me. And that was okay, because there aren't answers. So being in the not knowing and being in the mystery has to be okay. It has to be okay. And honestly, that's what the feminine is. The divine feminine is the mystery. And even though we say we're revolutionaries and all of these things, honestly, we're just being in love. So find love for you. Find out what nourishes you and loves you up, and do more of that. That would be how I would end it. That would be my friend.
No, I love that. Thank you so much. I really, really love that we were able to spend this time together today, for sure.
Thanks for tuning in to our discussion, and remember to share this with your friends. Lots of our sister friends who are in need of some validation and for some support within the wrestle, within the struggle, who are still wanting a spiritual path, who feel disillusionment, and who want to stay aligned with truth, and especially the embodied wisdom that lives within them. So share this podcast with your friends, and also go to standspeakshine.com/healing kit to receive some soul nourishment, free download to help nourish and support you on your path to finding your truth within. Remember to join our community of like-minded souls who are longing to feel, express, and be who they truly are. Women Seeking Wholeness on Facebook.